This is my true story. I gave my life to my son, thinking love would protect us both. I worked hard, slept little, and gave everything I had so he could live well. But one evening, when I was in pain, my son laughed at me. That moment broke me more than any wound. I knew then that love without respect was nothing. I made a choice that would change our family forever. I want to share this story so others may understand. Before I begin, please tell me where you are watching from and subscribe so this story reaches more hearts. From the day my son was born, I gave him my life without question. I worked every day without rest, from early morning until the moon rose high in the sky. I carried burdens quietly, never complaining to anyone. I gave without asking for thanks. I gave without measuring the cost. Every coin I earned, every drop of sweat, every aching bone was given so that my son could have what I never had. I bought his clothes when mine wore thin. I paid for his school when my pockets were empty. I gave him food before I fed myself. I gave him comfort when I slept on hard floors. I gave him warmth when I shivered in the cold. I gave him joy while keeping my tears hidden. I gave without pause because I thought that was the duty of a father. I believed that every long night of work, every moment of sacrifice, every sleepless hour was for him. I believed my devotion would build him a strong life. I thought I was giving him roots and wings, roots to remember where he came from, and wings to soar beyond my reach. I thought the years of sweat and toil would make him proud of the family we built. I thought he would stand beside me when I grew old. I thought he would carry my name with pride. I believed that love and sacrifice would be repaid in respect. For decades, I lived like this without complaint. I worked through sickness and fatigue without telling him. I bore hardship without letting him see my pain. I thought my quiet devotion was enough. I thought my life of giving would teach him the meaning of honor. I thought my actions would speak louder than words. I believed my love was a foundation so strong that nothing could shake it. I gave without asking, because a father's role, I believed, is endless. I gave because I trusted that blood would always call for respect. I gave because I believed in family above all else. I gave because I believed that sacrifice is the language of love. When my son was a child, he looked up at me with trust and wonder. He called me his hero. He trusted my words. He followed my lead. He wanted my attention, my approval, my warmth. I gave him my time, my energy, my soul. I thought we were building a bond stronger than life itself. I thought that he would grow into a man who would honor me. I thought my sacrifices were planting seeds of respect in his heart. But as he grew older, I began to notice changes. His pride grew, and with pride came arrogance. His respect for me faded slowly, like the dimming of a light. He began to question my decisions. He began to speak over me when we were together. He began to laugh at my advice in front of others. The boy who once clung to me now avoided my gaze. The young man who once listened now dismissed my words. He began to see my sacrifices not as acts of love, but as weakness. He began to treat my life of devotion as something to be mocked. I stayed quiet, hoping my patience would bring him back to me. I thought that time would heal the distance between us. I thought my sacrifices would speak louder than my words. I thought my silence would be a shield that could protect our bond. I believed that love could survive neglect. I believed that truth would shine in the end. But the truth I learned was harder than I imagined. Silence did not heal the wound. Patience without change only made me weaker. My giving did not bring the respect I had hoped for. The distance between us grew wider, and my heart grew heavier. Even then, I continued to give. I gave because I thought it was my duty as a father. I gave because I believed love was stronger than pain. I gave because I thought sacrifice could bridge the gap. I gave because I believed that in time, respect would return. I gave without complaint, hiding my tears, hiding my hurt. I carried every insult quietly, swallowing my pride, because I thought that was what a father must do. I thought I was teaching him strength, endurance, and patience. I thought I was showing him what love truly meant. But I was learning a different truth, that love without respect is an empty gift. Sacrifice without gratitude is a road with no end. I began to understand that a father could give everything and still be forgotten. I began to see that blood alone was not enough to keep a family together. I began to understand that respect must be earned, not assumed. I realized that I could no longer protect my dignity by silence alone. I knew then that my life of devotion had to be protected in a way he could never ignore. I knew that something had to change. I remember sitting alone one night, looking at photographs from years past. I saw myself carrying him as a baby, smiling through exhaustion. I saw myself working late nights, my hands rough and worn. I saw hope in my eyes, a hope that he would one day see my sacrifices as a gift. I saw a promise that was fading before my eyes. I felt the weight of decades pressing down on me. I knew that my silence could no longer protect me. I knew that I had to act for the sake of my dignity, for the sake of my love. I decided then that my life had been a gift, but it could not be given without meaning. I decided that my sacrifices must be honored with respect. I decided that silence was no longer the answer. I decided that I must protect my dignity. I decided that I must leave something meaningful behind, something that could teach the next generation the value of honor. I decided to act quietly, without anger, but with determination. I decided to protect the innocence of his children and to show them that respect is the greatest gift of all. I began to think about my grandchildren, those who had not yet been touched by the cruelty I faced. I thought about how my choice could shape their lives. I wanted to leave them a lesson that would last forever. I wanted them to understand what true respect means. I began to prepare quietly. I contacted my lawyer in secret. I began making plans that would ensure my life's work mattered, that my sacrifice would be remembered. I knew that this decision would change everything between me and my son. I knew it would not be easy. I knew it would cost me deeply. But I also knew it was the only way to protect my dignity and give my grandchildren a legacy worth remembering. I promised myself I would act with calm and clarity. I promised myself I would not let anger blind me. I promised myself I would speak with truth and purpose. I promised myself I would protect those who could not protect themselves. I promised myself I would leave behind a legacy worth remembering. I promised myself I would not bow to betrayal. I promised myself I would stand for justice, even if I stood alone. I knew this was my moment to prove that sacrifice, respect, and love were not empty words. And so I began to prepare for the day when I would make my choice known. I began to prepare for the moment when the truth of devotion would be seen. I began to prepare for the lesson that would change my family forever. I knew that my act would echo in their hearts for years to come. I knew that it would be a turning point, not only for me, but for the generations that followed. I knew that my love, my sacrifice, and my dignity would speak louder than any words ever could. As my son grew older, I began to notice changes in him. The boy who once clung to my hand now walked away without a word. The young man who once sought my advice now ignored my voice. His pride grew quietly, and with pride came arrogance. His respect for me began to fade slowly, almost without notice. I would call his name, and he would look away. I would offer guidance, and he would laugh. The warmth between us began to turn cold. It started with small things. He stopped asking about my health. He stopped seeking my opinion. He stopped inviting me to his world. I noticed he would avoid me at gatherings. He stopped showing appreciation for what I had done for him. I watched quietly as the distance between us grew. I believed that respect was something he would carry naturally, something that blood would guarantee. But I was wrong. At first, I told myself he was busy. I told myself that growing up meant separating from parents. I told myself that time would heal the changes. But the signs became harder to ignore. He began speaking harshly to me. His tone was sharp, his words filled with impatience. I felt the sting of disrespect in every sentence he spoke. I stayed quiet because I thought silence was strength, because I thought respect could not be forced. He began mocking my age, pointing out the wrinkles on my hands, the gray in my hair. He laughed when I spoke with care and concern. He dismissed my advice as outdated. I remember the first time he laughed openly at me in front of others. I felt a deep hurt, but I said nothing. I thought patience could repair what pride had broken. I thought my quiet endurance would bring him back. But the laughter grew louder. The mocking became a pattern. He would joke about me in front of friends and family. He would speak over me during conversations, treating me as if I were invisible. The son I had raised with love now treated me as a burden. I saw the joy in his laughter, but I felt the sorrow in my heart. I endured quietly, hiding my pain behind a mask of calm. I believed that one day he would understand, that one day respect would return. I began to notice how he spoke of me when I was not around. I heard whispers, comments filled with sarcasm. He told others I was weak, old, and useless. I learned that my sacrifices were being belittled. I realized that what I had built for him was taken for granted. My years of work, my sleepless nights, my sacrifices, all reduced to jokes and mocking words. The wounds were invisible, but deep. Even so, I did not speak up. I thought that to argue would lower me. I thought that silence was my way of showing strength. I thought endurance was proof of my love. But each insult, each act of disregard, left its mark on my heart. I began to feel the loneliness of being disrespected by one's own child. I began to understand that respect cannot be forced, it must be given freely. And when it is absent, the bond it protects begins to break. The signs became impossible to ignore. He laughed when I spoke about my dreams for him. He dismissed my concerns as unimportant. He treated me as though my years of struggle had no meaning. He laughed openly when I expressed pain. I tried to hide the hurt, but the wounds were growing. I knew that something had to change. I knew that silence could no longer protect my dignity. It became clear to me that this was not a passing phase. This was not youthful rebellion. This was a deliberate disregard for the man who had given him everything. His laughter was not a joke, it was a weapon. His disrespect was a statement that my years of sacrifice were meaningless to him. I began to question what I had built for him and why I had done it. I began to feel the betrayal of a lifetime. I remembered the nights I stayed awake to make sure he had what he needed. I remembered the times I worked through pain so that he could have comfort. I remembered the days I skipped my own meals so that his belly was full. I remembered carrying him through storms, carrying him through hardship, carrying him with my whole life. And yet, here he was, mocking my tears, treating my pain as a spectacle. The laughter burned in my mind. It became a wound that would not heal. It was not only a denial of respect, but also a denial of love. I began to understand that laughter can be cruelty when it is aimed at another's pain. I understood that mockery can destroy dignity. I realized that this was not just disrespect, it was betrayal. It was a turning point in the life I had shared with my son. For many nights, I sat alone, replaying the moments in my mind. I thought about what I had given him. I thought about what he had taken for granted. I thought about the silence I had kept. I thought about the laughter that now echoed in my heart. I knew I could not let this stand without action. I knew I could not let my dignity be stolen without giving a lesson that would last. I began to think about the meaning of respect. I began to think about the meaning of love. I began to understand that respect is the foundation of family. I began to see that love without respect is an empty gift. I realized that a father's role is not just to give, but also to teach. I realized that my duty was not only to build a life for my son, but also to protect the values that gave life meaning. I decided that my silence had to end. I decided that I could not allow mockery to replace love. I decided that I would answer not with anger, but with a lesson. I decided that I would ensure that my laughter and tears were remembered, not mocked. I decided that I would take action, quietly but firmly. I decided to protect the dignity that had been stripped away. That was the moment I knew my journey had changed. The signs of disrespect were no longer just signs. They were a call to action. I knew that I had to prepare for what was to come. I knew that the lesson I would give would not be for me alone. It would be for my grandchildren. I knew that the laughter he gave me in cruelty would be answered with truth in strength. That night came quietly, though the moment it arrived left a mark that I would never forget. The house was filled with ordinary sounds, wind brushing against the windows, the faint hum of an old fan, the ticking of a clock, but my heart felt heavy with an unspoken tension. I had spent the evening quietly, sitting in my chair, thinking about my son, about the laughter, about the signs of disrespect I could no longer ignore. We were talking, or at least I thought we were. I tried to speak gently, offering him advice the way a father offers wisdom. My words were soft, carried with care, but the answer I received was not. His voice rose quickly, filled with impatience. I could feel the change in the air. His tone shifted to mockery. I stayed silent at first, hoping the moment would pass. But it did not. Then, without warning, it happened. He laughed. Loud, cruel laughter. Not a quiet chuckle, not a moment of humor, but laughter that cut deep. He laughed at me as tears filled my eyes. I had never felt so small. The man who had given him his life was reduced to a joke. He pointed at me, smirking, as if my pain was entertainment. I sat there frozen, unsure if I should speak or retreat. I tried to stand, but my knees felt weak. My voice caught in my throat. The laughter echoed through the room, and I could hear others around us. Family, friends, watching. I felt their eyes, some filled with surprise, others with awkward discomfort. I could feel my dignity slipping away. His laughter was not a mistake. It was deliberate. It was a statement of power, of cruelty, of disregard. I thought about every moment that led to this. The years of work, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices I had made quietly. The days I labored under the sun so he could attend school. The nights I worked in silence so he could live in comfort. The years I gave without asking, without complaint. And here he was, erasing it all with a laugh. His laughter was a wound that cut deeper than any harsh word ever could. I wanted to speak, to explain my pain, but the words would not come. My throat felt dry, my voice weak. I simply sat there, tears rolling down my cheeks. I realized in that moment how much it hurt to be mocked by one's own child, how much it stung to have years of devotion dismissed in seconds. I realized that some wounds are not physical, but cut deeper into the soul. His laughter did not end. It grew louder, fueled by the shock of those who watched. I could see the delight in his eyes, the satisfaction in his cruelty. He wanted me humiliated, and he had succeeded. My tears became his entertainment. My sorrow became his triumph. The air between us was filled with shame, not his, but mine. I had been stripped of my dignity in front of everyone I loved. For a long moment, I sat still, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I thought about walking away, about retreating into silence, but deep inside, a voice told me that silence would be surrender, that this laughter must not be forgotten, that this moment must become the seed of a lesson for him, for the family, for the generations to come. I knew I could not let it pass without response. I looked into his eyes and saw nothing but mockery. I saw no remorse, no understanding, only arrogance. I understood then that the moment was not about me alone. It was about what he thought he could take without consequence. He thought my dignity was something he could strip away without cost. I knew then that cost would come, quietly, but fully. The laughter stopped only when others intervened. Family members stepped in, their voices gentle but firm, asking him to stop. But the damage was done. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of what had happened. I felt a mix of pain and resolve. Pain for what was lost in that moment, resolve for what had to come next. I did not speak that night. I did not beg for understanding or mercy. I simply sat with my hurt, letting it settle deep in my heart. I knew that words in that moment would be swallowed by his arrogance. I knew that respect could not be demanded. It must be earned. I realized that the laughter I had endured was no longer something I could bear in silence. That night, I made a decision. I would not let this moment pass without meaning. I would not allow his laughter to be the final word. I decided that I would answer in a way that could not be ignored. I decided that I would turn this cruelty into a lesson that would last for years. I decided that I would act not out of anger, but out of purpose. I began to see the moment not as the end of something, but the beginning of something else. The laughter that had cut me became the spark of resolve. The humiliation became the foundation for my next step. I knew that my silence had been broken. I knew that my dignity demanded action. I knew that my son's laughter could not go unanswered. That was the night I realized that respect is not given, it is earned. That cruelty can only be answered with truth. That laughter at another's pain is a cruelty that must be confronted. That dignity is something worth defending, even if the cost is great. That night, I began to prepare, not for a moment of anger, but for a moment of justice. And I knew that justice would not be quick. It would not be loud. It would be quiet, deliberate, and powerful. I knew it would come in a way that would teach my son the meaning of respect. I knew it would come in a way that his laughter could never erase. I knew it would be a lesson, not just for him, but for his children. That cruel moment became the turning point in my life. It became the moment when I stopped accepting silence. It became the moment when I began to plan a quiet, certain form of retribution. It became the moment when I decided that his laughter would not be the last word in our story. From that night, I began to work in silence. I began to gather proof. I began to prepare a path that would answer the cruelty not with rage, but with a truth so clear it could not be denied. I began to ensure that his laughter would be replaced by understanding, that his cruelty would be met with consequence. I knew that the road ahead would be hard. I knew that it would take time. I knew that it would require patience and careful thought. But I also knew that I could not let this moment fade into silence. I knew that what happened could not be forgotten. I knew that a father's dignity must be defended. That night, in the quiet of my room, I made a promise to myself. I promised that his laughter would not define me. I promised that my tears would not be in vain. I promised that I would find a way to turn his cruelty into a lesson that could not be ignored. I promised that I would give my children and grandchildren a future where respect was restored. And so began my journey, not with anger, not with loud confrontation, but with quiet resolve. That cruel moment became the seed of something greater. It became the reason I would not remain silent. It became the moment that shaped my path forward. That night, after the laughter had faded and the voices in the house had gone quiet, I sat alone in my small room. The room was dark, except for the faint light coming from the street lamp outside the window. I could still hear faint murmurs of family in the distance, but inside my heart, there was a storm. I sat quietly, holding my head in my hands, letting my thoughts flow without interruption. I thought of the laughter again, replaying it in my mind. I thought of how easy it had been for him to throw away years of love with a cruel sound. I thought of how my tears had become his weapon. I began to remember the years I had lived for him. I thought about his childhood, how I worked so hard to make sure he had everything he wanted. I remembered carrying him on my shoulders when he was too tired to walk, buying his shoes even when I could not afford them, making sure he had food when I myself ate less. I thought of every time I stayed up late to keep the house warm for him, every time I gave up rest to work extra hours so he could have better clothes, books, and education. Those memories came to me with a heavy weight, and the pain of them mixed with the insult I had received. I thought about what it meant to be a father. I realized that I had given everything without asking for recognition. I had given because I believed that love meant giving. I had given because I thought family was sacred. I had given because I believed that what I offered would grow into something lasting in him. But I now saw that respect could not be assumed and love could be forgotten when it was not spoken back in gratitude. That night, I realized silence was no protection. It was acceptance of pain without justice. I sat there for hours, replaying every moment between us. I thought about his words, the sharpness in them, and the laughter that followed. I wondered if he even understood the depth of what he had done. I wondered if he knew how much those words and that laughter had cut me. I remembered my own father, who had never spoken so harshly, and how I had promised myself I would never forget the lesson of respect he taught me. I thought of the generations before us, of the tradition of fathers protecting their children, and how mine had been tested now by my own son. The house was silent, except for my breathing. I thought about what silence meant to me now. It meant hiding pain. It meant swallowing wounds. It meant accepting humiliation without answer. I could not let silence be my answer anymore. I knew that if I continued in silence, it would be like allowing him to laugh at me forever without consequence. I thought about dignity and how fragile it could be when met with cruelty. That night, I understood that dignity must be defended quietly but firmly, and that revenge was not about violence, but about making truth visible. I thought of my grandchildren. They were still young, unaware of the depth of this pain, unaware of what I endured. I knew that my actions now would teach them something important. I thought about the lessons I wanted to give them, lessons about love, about respect, about protecting oneself, about standing for dignity. I thought about how they would remember me. I thought about what kind of legacy I wanted to leave behind for them. I decided that their future was worth fighting for. As I sat in that silence, I began to plan. I did not plan in anger, but in quiet determination. I thought about how I could turn this pain into something meaningful. I thought about how I could give my grandchildren a gift that carried my voice even after I was gone. I began to consider my options and how I could ensure that my son would never treat me or any other person with such disregard again. I realized that the lesson had to be public, so it could be seen and remembered. The night was deep, and my mind was still awake. I thought about the years of sacrifice, the nights of worry, the mornings of exhaustion. I thought about every tear I had hidden, every bruise I had covered, every word I had swallowed. I realized I had lived with a silent pain for too long. I realized that pain had to become action. I understood that my silence had become a cage, and I had to break free. That night, I made a decision that I would not change. I promised myself I would not let this moment be erased. I promised that my tears would become a voice for justice. I promised that I would act, not out of bitterness, but out of the need to teach. I promised that I would make sure his laughter could not echo forever without answer. I promised that I would transform this heartbreak into a lesson that his children would carry with them for life. And so, I sat in that quiet room, with the weight of the past heavy on my shoulders and the resolve of the future in my heart. I let the silence speak to me, and I knew that my next step would change everything. I knew that from this reflection, action must follow. I knew that the moment of laughter was no longer just a moment. It was a call to stand, to speak, and to teach. That night, I began my silent journey toward a reckoning. I began to collect my thoughts and my proof. I began to prepare the quiet but certain response that would echo far beyond the walls of that room. I began to shape my legacy, knowing that the lesson I planned would be more powerful than any word I could speak in anger. The morning after I had spent the night in quiet reflection, I woke with a strange calm. The pain of my son's laughter still lingered, but now it had been replaced by resolve. I knew that silence had cost me too much already. I knew that if I stayed silent now, I would betray everything I had built for decades. I knew that I could no longer let my dignity be stolen without answer. My tears had been mocked once, and I refused to let them be mocked again. That morning, I decided that my next step must be decisive, thoughtful, and final. I understood that my decision must not be driven by anger. Anger fades, but truth remains. I told myself that my response must be something lasting. I could not give back pain with pain. I had to give back truth with consequence. I thought about what I wanted to accomplish. I wanted to protect my dignity. I wanted to teach my son and my grandchildren a lesson about respect. I wanted to show that cruelty without answer only weakens a man, but dignity defended becomes strength. I wanted my actions to speak louder than the years of my silence. I began to see clearly what this decision would mean. It would not be easy. It would not be painless. But it would be necessary. I knew that my son would never listen to me in a conversation, and that words alone would not be enough. I knew that I needed a plan that would speak louder than words ever could. I knew that I had to act in a way that would be undeniable and lasting. I thought of all the years I had lived for him, and how those years deserved recognition, not in words, but in justice. I called my lawyer in the quiet of that morning. I did not tell him everything at once, but I spoke with calm clarity. I told him that I wished to change my will. I told him that my decision was final and that it had been thought through carefully. I said that I wanted to ensure that my wealth, my property, and everything I had worked for would be directed in a way that carried meaning. I told him that my son would inherit nothing and that everything would go to his children instead. I told him it was not anger, but a lesson I wanted to leave behind. The lawyer listened without interruption. I sent him all the documents and proof he needed to prepare the changes. I did not speak of revenge in the way the world might imagine. This was not about punishment for the sake of pain. It was about justice for my years of sacrifice. It was about protecting the next generation from repeating mistakes of cruelty. It was about making sure my own dignity was restored before it was too late. I wanted this decision to be clear, unshakable, and remembered forever. As I worked quietly on these plans, I thought about my son. I thought about how easy it had been for him to laugh at me. I thought about how little he had seen of what I had given. I thought about how he had forgotten the sacrifices of a lifetime. I thought about how respect had faded into contempt. And I thought about how, through this decision, I could make him understand that respect is not a right. It is something earned. My will would speak louder than any words I could say in anger. My decision would carry weight for years beyond my life. The days passed, and the lawyer prepared everything in secret. I met with him quietly, always making sure my son would not suspect. I did not want confrontation. I wanted resolution. I wanted this to be something final. I wanted my legacy to be a lesson that could not be erased. I thought about how my grandchildren would see this act. I wanted them to understand that justice comes not from revenge, but from careful action and truth. I wanted them to remember that dignity is worth defending. I thought about the moment when I would reveal my decision. I knew it would not be easy to see my son's face when he understood what I had done. I knew there would be silence, shock, and perhaps anger. But I also knew that my decision was not about hurting him. It was about protecting what was right. I told myself that I was acting not for me alone, but for my grandchildren, for the family name, and for the lesson that respect must be defended. I told myself this was my moment to stand. The plan was set. Everything was arranged quietly and without drama. I had my lawyer prepare the papers, ensure their legality, and make them binding beyond dispute. I had prepared my own heart for what was to come. I knew there would be whispers, perhaps even accusations, but I had made peace with that. I had made peace because I knew that this decision was not born of bitterness, but of truth. I had decided that dignity could not be surrendered quietly anymore. That morning, I sat quietly once again. I thought of all the years behind me. I thought of the sacrifices that had gone unnoticed. I thought of the laughter that had cut deeper than any wound. I thought of my tears and how they had been turned into a mockery. And I knew that the decision I had made was not just about money or inheritance. It was about teaching something eternal. I decided that my legacy would not be stolen. I decided that my grandchildren would know the truth of my life and my choice. And so, with quiet determination, I stepped into my next chapter. I had made my decision, and I knew it would change everything. I knew it would break the silence, end the mockery, and restore the lesson of respect. I knew that I was no longer just a father who gave. I was a father who chose to teach. My decision was complete. My resolve was set. My legacy was now in motion. The day I had long prepared for came quietly, without warning, but with the weight of years behind it. I woke early that morning with a calm that was different from before. This was not a day for anger or pride. It was a day for truth. I knew that my decision, made in silence, was ready to be revealed. I thought of the moment ahead as a quiet act of justice, not spectacle. I told myself that truth, once spoken, would carry more power than anything I could have done in anger. For weeks before that day, I had imagined what it would be like to stand before my family and speak. I had thought about the expressions on my son's face. I had thought about my grandchildren and how they would see me. I had thought about my neighbors, about relatives, about the meaning of family itself. I understood that my revelation would be more than words. It would be an action that carried years of sacrifice, pain, and dignity into one moment. I told myself that this moment would stand as a lesson far longer than any conversation ever could. That morning, I prepared quietly. I dressed in clothes that I knew carried my own history, clothes that reminded me of a life of labor and love. I kept the papers in my pocket, the legal proof of my decision that my lawyer had prepared. I thought about the strength it had taken to make such a choice. I thought about the nights I had stayed awake, planning this day. I thought about the tears I had hidden and the laughter I had endured, and I felt a quiet peace because I knew I was ready. When the time came to stand before my family, I did so without haste. I walked calmly, each step carrying the weight of years. I chose my place in the gathering so that every eye could see me. I knew that the moment of revelation must be clear, without confusion. My son was there, as was his family, unaware of what I was about to do. The room was filled with chatter, laughter, and the normal noise of a family gathering. But I could hear only my own heart, steady and determined. I began by speaking simply, without anger or accusation. I spoke of years of sacrifice, of the work I had done quietly, without complaint. I spoke of the nights when I had gone without food so that my son could eat. I spoke of the hard work and long hours, of the dreams I had held for my family. I did not speak to shame my son in anger, but to remind everyone of the truth. I spoke so that the children and everyone present could understand the meaning behind what I was about to reveal. Then, with steady hands, I held the papers before them. I told them that these papers contained my will, my final decision about what I would leave behind. I told them that after years of devotion, I had chosen to change my will entirely. I said clearly that my son would inherit nothing and that everything I had worked for would go to his children instead. I explained that this was not a decision of anger, but a decision of truth, a decision of justice. I told them this was the legacy I wanted to leave, one that carried the lesson of respect, not mockery. As I spoke, silence fell over the crowd. My voice was steady, and I spoke with a calmness. That surprised even myself. I watched as my son's face changed. First there was disbelief, then anger, then a silence that seemed to freeze the air. His children looked at me with wide eyes, unsure of what they were hearing. Relatives whispered to each other quietly, some nodding in agreement, others in shock. I knew that the moment was working as I had intended. My revelation was not just words, it was a living truth they would all carry forward. I took the papers and placed them on the table where everyone could see them. I did not shout. I did not demand attention. I let the silence that followed speak louder than any words. I let the weight of my years of sacrifice, of my decision, settle in the room. I wanted everyone present to understand that this was not a moment of vengeance, but of final clarity. I wanted them to know that this was a father's answer to a wound that had been caused by mockery, laughter, and betrayal. My son said nothing. He looked away, his shoulders heavy, as if the weight of my years and my decision had struck him deeper than anything I had said before. His children looked to me with confusion, perhaps understanding something they could not yet put into words. Others in the room looked at me with respect and sorrow, knowing the depth of what had just been revealed. I knew that the lesson I had chosen to give was now written into the hearts of everyone present. That moment, though brief, carried the weight of a lifetime. I did not need applause. I did not need validation. I needed only for truth to be spoken and for justice to be done. I knew that my revelation had changed the course of our family. I knew that my decision would be remembered long after I was gone, and I knew that in that silence, respect had been restored. As I stepped away from the table, I felt a quiet peace settle within me. The act was done. The truth was spoken. The laughter that had once wounded me had been answered, not with anger, but with clarity. I knew that my grandchildren would carry this lesson, and perhaps one day they would understand fully what I had given them that day. I walked away calmly, knowing that my revelation was complete and that my legacy was set. The moment I spoke and placed the papers before everyone, the air changed. Silence fell heavier than any words I had spoken before. My son stood frozen, staring at the papers as if they had burned his hands. I could see the shock written clearly on his face, a mixture of disbelief, anger, and regret. The room felt still. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. The chatter and laughter that had filled the gathering minutes before was gone. It was replaced by a silence that spoke louder than any voice could. I watched my son's face closely. The arrogance he once carried so freely was gone. His shoulders slumped, his chest tightened, and his eyes avoided mine. He opened his mouth, perhaps to speak, but closed it again. I saw him trying to find words that would not come. I could see the weight of years of misunderstanding pressing upon him. The son, who had once laughed at my pain, now stood speechless before the truth I had given him. I knew that the moment had struck deeper than I could have imagined. Around him, my grandchildren looked with wide eyes. They looked confused, unsure of what had just happened, but they sensed the gravity of it. They glanced at their father and then at me, searching for meaning in the silence. They were too young to understand fully, but I could tell that this would be a memory they would carry for the rest of their lives. I saw questions forming in their eyes, questions they would not forget. I knew that in that moment, the lesson I wanted to give was taking root. The rest of the family looked on with varied expressions. Some whispered quietly among themselves, as if trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Others nodded subtly, showing respect for what I had done. There were looks of sorrow, understanding, and some disbelief. I knew that my revelation had shifted the balance in that room. What had once been private pain was now public truth. I knew that silence had now become a powerful teacher. My son remained still, not daring to speak. I felt no need to break the silence. I let it stretch, allowing the weight of my decision to settle fully. I wanted him to feel the meaning of what had happened. I wanted him to understand that his words and actions had consequences. I wanted the truth to live in that silence, to echo in every mind present. I knew that sometimes silence carries a louder truth than any argument. The neighbors who had come to the gathering began to speak quietly among themselves. Their faces showed surprise and curiosity. Some looked toward me with quiet respect. Others looked toward my son with disappointment. I knew that the story of that moment would spread beyond the gathering. I knew that my decision would not only be remembered, but spoken of. It would become part of the memory of our family. I felt certain that what I had done would carry meaning for years to come. The weight of the moment lingered. I looked around the room slowly, seeing faces that reflected a mixture of emotions: shock, respect, sadness, understanding. I felt a quiet peace because I knew my purpose had been fulfilled. I knew that I had given a lesson stronger than any lecture. I had given a lesson through truth and dignity. My son had been stripped of his arrogance, and my family had been given clarity. That was the moment I had worked for quietly for so long, and even as the silence continued, I could see the change. I could see that my son's pride had been broken. I could see that my grandchildren had learned something important about respect. I could feel that my family understood the depth of my sacrifice. I knew that this shock, this quiet revelation, would remain in their hearts. I knew that my choice had created a moment none of us would forget. The shock was not just for my son. It was for everyone who heard the truth. After the shock settled, the room remained quiet, but the air was filled with whispers. I could hear soft voices questioning, confirming, and sharing what they had just witnessed. My son still stood frozen, unable to respond. His children looked at him with confusion and hurt, unsure why their father was silent and why the truth had been placed before them so openly. I could see the change in their eyes, a change that was growing stronger with every second of silence. They were beginning to understand the weight of what had happened. The relatives who had gathered around began to murmur quietly among themselves. Some expressed sadness. Others showed quiet respect toward me. I could see a mixture of pity and admiration on their faces. I knew that the revelation I had made had not only hurt my son, but also shifted the perception of our entire family. I could feel that this moment was being remembered already, like a turning point that would be talked about for years. I knew I had struck at something far deeper than pride. My son's shoulders slumped further as he stood there without words. I did not move. I let him stand in silence, letting him feel the weight of his own actions. I knew this was more powerful than any argument I could make. This silence was a lesson itself. My grandchildren, who had been watching with uncertain eyes, now looked with seriousness. I could see them slowly understanding that the laughter at my pain had consequences beyond what they had ever imagined. I knew that the lesson was sinking in. A few of my relatives came closer to me quietly. They nodded their heads as if saying without words that they agreed with my choice. I felt a quiet warmth of understanding, a sense that I had done right. But even in that warmth, I felt the heavy burden of years of pain. My son's silence was not just the absence of words, it was the presence of shame. I could see it in his eyes and in the way he avoided looking at me. He knew he had lost something more than money or inheritance. He had lost respect. Neighbors who had attended the gathering began talking softly in corners. They looked at my son differently now. I could hear fragments of conversations about pride, respect, and truth. I knew that what had happened would become part of the memory of this community. I understood then that my decision had not only altered my family, but also sent a message to everyone who had been watching. Respect and truth had been restored that day, and the silence after my revelation carried that message loudly. I saw my grandchildren approaching me slowly. They were quiet, almost cautious. They looked at me with a new kind of respect. I could see their minds working, piecing together what had happened. I wanted to tell them they were the reason I had acted, but I knew the lesson would last longer if they discovered it themselves. I understood that they were carrying the truth of that day into their hearts. I knew that my actions would shape how they valued respect and truth for the rest of their lives. The gathering slowly began to break up. People left quietly, still talking softly about what they had seen. My son left last, his head bowed. There was no argument, no shout, no protest. He left in silence, carrying the weight of what had been revealed. I stayed back, watching quietly as the room emptied. I felt a strange peace settle over me. The lesson was given. The truth was known. The fallout was complete. I knew this was not the end, but a new beginning for my family. I knew that my decision would follow us for years. It would be remembered as the day when truth became louder than insult, when dignity became stronger than pride. My son had lost his arrogance, and my family had gained clarity. My grandchildren had been given a lesson that could never be taken away. That day, respect was restored, and silence became the voice of truth. That was the true fallout of my choice, a lasting change that would remain forever in our hearts. After the silence had settled over the gathering, I began to walk away calmly. My steps were slow but certain. I did not rush, because I knew the weight of what had happened was already in the air. Every eye was upon me, some filled with respect, others with pity, and some with disbelief. I walked without looking back, because I knew there was nothing more to say. The truth had already been spoken. My actions had already told the story. I did not need to argue. I did not need to explain. As I walked toward the edge of the gathering, I could feel the tension still lingering. It was thick in the air, almost like a weight pressing down. I could hear whispers following me, soft words carried across the crowd. I knew they were talking about what had just happened, about what I had revealed, and about the choice I had made. I understood then that this moment was not just about me or my son, but about teaching something far deeper. It was about teaching a lesson in respect, dignity, and truth. My grandchildren looked at me as I passed. Their faces showed something new, a quiet seriousness that I had not seen before. I knew that they were thinking, trying to understand. I knew that the moment had left its mark on them. I wanted them to know that respect must be earned, that truth matters, and that actions speak louder than words. I walked on quietly, carrying this thought with me. The silence I left behind was louder than any speech I could have made. I reached the edge of the gathering, and I turned my face toward the open road. The air was calm, but my mind was full. I thought about the years of my life that had led to this moment. I thought about every night I had worked without rest, every sacrifice I had made, every tear I had hidden. I thought about the insult, the laughter at my pain, and the long years of silence. I thought about the choice I had made and the peace I now felt. I knew this was my moment to walk away with dignity. As I stepped away, I felt a strange lightness in my heart. The weight of years of pain was lifting. I did not feel anger, even though I could have. I did not feel regret, even though the cost had been high. I felt peace. I knew that I had done what I must. I knew that I had given my grandchildren a gift that could never be taken away, the lesson that dignity and respect are worth more than anything else. I understood that this exit was not an end, but a beginning for them. I walked further, each step carrying the memory of the gathering with me. I felt the eyes of my family still upon me, but I no longer carried their judgment. I carried my own truth. I carried the knowledge that I had acted not in anger, but in love. I had acted not to punish, but to teach. I had acted not to destroy, but to build something lasting. This was my final gift to them, a lesson that would live on far longer than words could. Before I left the grounds completely, I paused for a moment. I looked back at the place where my family had gathered, where my son had stood silent, where my truth had been heard. I felt no bitterness, only clarity. I knew that my act would be remembered. I knew that my exit would carry its own story. And I knew that the lesson I had given would echo through generations. I walked away knowing that I had done what was right. I walked away with peace in my heart. That day, I learned that an exit can be more powerful than a battle, that silence can speak louder than shouts, that walking away with dignity can teach more than revenge. I learned that respect must be shown, not demanded, that love without respect is incomplete, that truth, once spoken, can change hearts forever. I walked away, knowing my lesson was done. My act had spoken, and my exit had sealed it. Now, as an old man, I tell this story not with anger, but with calm. I tell it with clarity, because the years have taught me what matters most. I tell it so others may understand that respect and dignity are worth protecting above all else. I tell it because my life has been shaped by both sacrifice and betrayal, and because I want the next generation to learn from what I lived. I tell it so they understand that every choice we make leaves a mark on those who come after us. I tell it so my grandchildren will know the truth of what happened. I reflect on my son's laughter at my pain. That moment was more than an insult. It was the breaking point of a lifetime of silence. I learned that wounds run deeper when they come from those we love. I learned that the cruelty of laughter can cut deeper than the sharpest words. I learned that betrayal is not measured by what is taken, but by what is denied: respect, care, and truth. And I learned that silence in the face of such cruelty is itself a form of surrender. I learned that silence can become a wound of its own. I remember the moment I decided to act. It was not born of anger, but of love for the family I had built. It was born of the desire to teach a lesson that could not be forgotten. I knew then that my son would not change without truth being spoken. I knew that my dignity could not be restored without action. I knew that my silence would mean allowing cruelty to go unanswered. I realized I had to speak, to act, and to leave something that would stand as proof of what had been. Looking back, I see that my choice was not easy. It meant breaking bonds that I had hoped would last forever. It meant choosing a path that would bring pain to my heart. It meant accepting that my son would never see me as I once believed he would, but I also saw that it was necessary. Necessary not just for me, but for the family as a whole. Necessary so that respect could be taught through action and not just words. Necessary so that the next generation could learn what dignity truly means. My children and grandchildren have since spoken of that day as if it were a turning point. They say they saw something in me that they will never forget. They say they learned a lesson about courage and respect. They say they learned that dignity is not given, it is defended. And they say they learned that truth, when spoken with calm and clarity, can change hearts and minds. I did not tell them this to hurt my son, but to protect the legacy of the family I loved. Now, as I sit quietly in my old age, I realize that my son lost more than my love that day. He lost the chance to understand the depth of a father's sacrifice. He lost the gift of a legacy built on years of hard work and care. But he also lost something I cannot give back, the chance to learn that laughter at another's pain is the deepest cruelty of all. My son will go through life carrying his own lesson, whether he understands it or not. That is not my place to decide. That is his own truth to discover. I have learned that love without respect is empty, that forgiveness without understanding can leave wounds unhealed, that dignity comes not from being honored by others, but from honoring oneself. I have learned that the greatest revenge is not to harm, but to protect those who cannot protect themselves. I have learned that the most lasting lesson comes not from words alone, but from action. I have learned that a grandfather's role is not only to protect, but to teach with the wisdom of a lifetime. And so, I end my story with this truth. My son laughed when I cried, but I made sure his children would never laugh at him. My act was not born of vengeance alone, but of a hope that respect and dignity would be passed on to those who would follow. I know now that the legacy of a life is not measured by what you leave behind, but by the lessons you give. I know that my exit from that gathering was not an end, but a beginning of a new story for my family, a story of courage, truth, and respect. My final thought is this: the world will not always honor what is right, but it will remember what was done with love and purpose. I have lived my life with sacrifice, patience, and quiet strength. I have learned that truth is the strongest legacy one can leave, and I know that my act, my lesson, and my exit will live on far longer than my years. That is the peace I now carry in my heart. That is the lesson I leave behind.